Asato ma sadgamaya, tamaso ma jyotirgamaya, mrityo ma agritam gamaya, aviravirma eti, rudrayate dakshinamukam te namam pahi nityam. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Lead us from the ever-changing to the unchanging. Lead us from the darkness of ignorance to the light of knowledge. Lead us from the death of the body to the eternal life of the spirit. Light us through and through, and guide us evermore with thy loving presence. May we know the Supreme Being, the Adorable One, the light of all lights, who manifests and sustains this universe. He, the Supreme Ruler of all the rulers, the Supreme Master of all the masters, the Supreme Deity of all the deities. May that Supreme Being manifest unto us. May we worship him with loving devotion. Peace, peace, peace be unto all. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where each of you might be. Swami Vivekananda saw this coming. One world. We are one world now in so many ways. Physically, electronically, commercially, environmentally. It had never occurred to me that from this small chapel in St. Louis I could be speaking to all of you in different parts of our planet. But Vivekananda saw this coming, and he knew how vitally important it is to bring the oneness of Advaita, non-dualism, into that one world for so many reasons. Advaita, non-dualism, is the source of ethics, the springboard to unselfish service, and the basis of all true unselfishness. So much needed in our shrinking world, where we're interdependent and need to get along with each other for our own good and aren't really doing a very good job of it on the whole. But that's not the topic today. The topic is self-denial and self-manifestation. Now, there's an apparent contradiction here in the topic. Self-denial and self-manifestation. How can we have self-development, that is self-manifestation, when the self is denied, restrained, ignored, or rejected? The self in self-denial and the self in self-manifestation actually refer to two selves. The self in self-denial refers to the apparent self, and the self in self-manifestation refers to the higher self. So, we've added a complication. Are we two selves or one self? There's just one self with many disguises. The one sun that illumines this world appears differently at different times. At dawn and sunset, the sun appears larger and not as bright. Not as bright as it is during the day. That same sun appears brighter or dimmer according to cloud cover and atmospheric conditions during the day. But it is the same sun. We recently had the residue of a Saharan desert sandstorm float over St. Louis in the high atmosphere, very fine particles that gave us just gorgeous sunsets for a couple of days. It looked different, but it's the same sun, 93 million miles away, appearing in different terrestrial condition to us as being different. And it seems to be moving around from horizon to horizon when actually it's the Earth that's revolving. But the disguise of the apparent self with respect to the higher self is a different kind of disguise. Normally, when a person puts on a mask or takes a part in a play or adopts the role of a spy, he or she knows who they are, and they try to fool other people. This apparent self is a different sort of disguise, in that we deceive ourselves first, and then others. The whole problem is that we don't know the higher self. And the primary disguise of the apparent self, the primary disguise, is the body-mind complex that we put on at conception and wear until death. Sri Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita, he calls it a garment that we put on and wear and then cast away at death. And Swami Vivekananda died in Calcutta on July 4th, 1902. That same day he appeared to Swami Ramakrishnananda, who was in South India, in Chennai, saying, "Sashi, I cast off the body." Actually, it was more graphic than that. He said, "I spat out the body." For world teachers like Sri Krishna and Swami Vivekananda, it's as plain as day. When they say I, if they say I, they're not referring to this body or the body-mind complex. What it is that they are referring to is not so clear to the rest of us. For most of us, it's plain as day that we are the ever-changing body-mind complex. How do we deceive ourselves with respect to our primary disguise? We are not actually the body or the mind or their aggregate. We are actually the knower of the body, the knower of the mind, and the knower of the sensible universe, the external world. And we are distinct from everything known. The unchanging observer, the knower, is changeless. Changes signify a frame of reference that is at rest, unchanging. Change is measured against something that is not changing. The unchanging observer is the real person. But we don't experience the unchanging observer, the knower, as it is. That knower is always mixed up with the process of knowledge. The knower, the process of knowledge, and the objects of knowledge are experienced as a dynamic process. We can infer the existence of the unchanging observer from our relative experience. There must be a knower. What maintains the continuity of our identification through all these changes? But the ordinary person, and by ordinary person, I mean men and women who are not illumined, who have not experienced the higher self, the ordinary person doesn't separate the knower from the process of knowledge. And for the regular person, the objects of knowledge are much more real than the knower. And since the body and mind are with us in the waking state from cradle to grave, the body-mind complex becomes the most real object of our experience and our primary disguise. So to recap, it is the apparent self of self-denial that must be restrained, controlled, and the higher self, the knower, the unchanging observer, that is to be manifested. Now, the unchanging observer, the knower, Shakshi Chaitanya, is linked to the body and mind through a mode of mind called egoism. And through egoism, it finds expression in the body and mind. The I of egoism is identified with the body and its conditions through the changes of birth, growth, decay, and death. I am young or old, tall or short, handsome or ugly, healthy or ill, strong or weak, and always changing. The I of egoism is identified with the mind and its conditions. I'm happy or unhappy, I'm angry or calm, I know or don't know. And the ego, being identified with the changes of the body and mind, is like trying to catch a shooting star, because body and mind are constantly in flux on the macro level and on the micro level. And the closer we look, the more they're changing. If you look at the atomic level, things are just moving so furiously. This ego wears us out. And the only time we ordinarily get rest from the yoke of the ego is in deep sleep, in dreamless sleep, when we throw off the yoke of the ego and rest in our own nature, though unconsciously. We rest in the knower, but there's a veil of ignorance, and we don't come out of deep sleep every night as illumined souls. We come out of deep sleep the same person who fell asleep the night before, but hopefully with good rest. And it's that deep sleep, that part of sleep when we throw off the ego, where we really get our much needed deep rest. So the unchanging observer, the knower within, is linked to the body-mind through egoism. Now the mind, and we'll talk about that in more detail later, is intermediary between our body and that unchanging observer. When the mind turns upward towards the unchanging observer, the real self, we get more knowledge and joy and more and deeper understanding. And when the mind turns to the body, that becomes more real. We get more selfishness. Selfishness and sense attachment get hold of us. And it is by restraining these desires that are born from our identification with the body and the senses that we make progress as human beings, secular or spiritual. By way of example, we can't even have physical health without self-restraint. As the French say, we dig our graves with our teeth. In the short term, if we overeat at a meal, that may make us uncomfortable until the next meal. Or if we really overdo it, we can make ourselves sick. It can affect our digestion and our ability to assimilate that meal. Too much of a good thing. And it's strange because it only tastes good from the front of the mouth to the back of the mouth. After there, it's gone. There are long-term consequences as well to physical health if we don't practice restraint with respect to eating and so forth. Some years ago, I went to a funeral of one of our close devotees in the South, and for the day or two that I was there, I ate with the children of our devotee, and that he had two girls. They aren't girls now, and the older one was the one who cooked, and we ate our meals together with the other sister and her family. And I was really enjoying the food. They'd have cornbread with every meal, breakfast included. And it'd be made fresh every time in a cast iron skillet. You stick it in the oven, you turn the skillet over, it plops out. You put butter on it and put it on the table. The best cornbread I've ever tasted. And other things. It was just really good. And I mentioned it. And she said, well, she said, we cooked the same way our grandparents did. That cornbread, for instance, we add this much butter, I forgot the measurement, but a huge amount of butter to the cornbread, and then we slather it with butter after it's cooked while it's warm before you eat it. And she said, and the same goes with the rest of our food. She says, and you might think this is strange. She said, my sister and I are both registered nurses. And we know that statistically, eating like this will take about 5 years off our lives. She smiled and she said, but we'll die happy. So she stated very clearly the premise that a lot of people have. I'm going to enjoy this life. In this case, it means I want to enjoy how the food tastes during my meals, 3 meals a day. And if it takes a little time off my life, I'll pay for it. I'd be happy to pay for it with that enjoyment. Okay? So the reality lies there through the senses, through the sense of taste. So a related story. We're talking a little bit about happiness before we get back to the main topic. So how to introduce this? One of our longtime devotees who came here with her husband in the mid-50s and have been stalwarts in the center since that time. And it never takes the position of a teacher, but her life is so steady and so exemplary. She's always doing things for the center. It's the center of her life. She's regular in her spiritual practice. And in all her habits, you can set a clock by her regularity. But she never takes the position of a teacher that she knows anything or tries to tell anyone anything with relation to the spirit. And you try to draw her out, and she says, oh, I don't know. But she does. You can tell by her life. Her life's a very good example for others. So she was in the office doing something, and I don't know why I did this, but for some reason I said, what's the secret of happiness? And there was a pause, a short pause. And she said, the secret of happiness is to have a goal in life. And the higher the goal, the better. And the highest goal is to realize God. End of conversation. She went on to her next thing that she needed to do. Very succinct. If we want to control our lower self, we need to look up. The highest goal is God realization. The highest happiness is God realization. That's the secret. Now, not many people have spiritual realization as their primary goal in life. So what she said is true whether our goal is secular or spiritual. Having a goal integrates the ego and puts relative priority on the various facets of life. If you want to be a professional athlete, so many aspects related to health have to be regulated, starting with the type, quality, and regularity of the food that we eat. Then there's a mental aspect to athletic training as well. Everything is regulated for that one goal. If our goal is spiritual, we need a healthy body to sustain spiritual discipline. The health of the body and mind is a means to the ultimate end of realizing God. We don't want to be at the end of our life when we realize God, or whenever most people realize God at the end. We don't want to be like the elephant in Ramakrishna's little aphorism, the elephant of spiritual realization taking a bath in a farm pond and just kind of messing the whole thing up. We want to be a little larger receptacle for that spiritual experience. So it's important to have a healthy mind and body, not just for the exercise of getting there, the spiritual practice, but for the experience itself. Food has to be evaluated not just for nutrition and quality and quantity, but for its effect on the mind. Certain foods agitate the mind while others calm it. And you learn this from experience with your own system. The whole process of food intake can be reverse engineered from our ultimate goal. In any case, keeping our bodies healthy requires self-restraint, self-control, and is necessary in order to meet our higher goal, whether that goal is secular or spiritual. Where is our superiority as human beings with respect to the other living creatures? It's in the power to discriminate right and wrong. Moral life does not exist at the subhuman level. In human life, we have the power of reasoning, and it is a great privilege of human life to exercise it. It's hard work, though. We get tired. It wears us out. Essentially, as Vedanta teaches, we are pure, free, and perfect, but this real self is mixed up with the psychophysical constitution, which is not pure and perfect. We're not born with a blank slate. We're not born pure and free, at least with respect to our minds, as some of the philosophers of the Enlightenment thought. Natural man was the state to be in, and those natural, what came natural to us should be expressed rather than restrained. And we're certainly not equal with respect to the minds that we bring into this body. The real person, the Atman, the unchanging observer, is pure and free, and the same in everyone, absolutely the same. But this body-mind complex, in this body-mind complex, there are many factors that are not very desirable, that are hidden in the unconscious mind. The past samskaras that we bring into this life are good and bad, and they're not all accessible to the conscious mind. So this body and mind need to be regulated in order to manifest the higher self. It needs to be controlled even for physical development. For intellectual development, it needs to be restrained and controlled. For aesthetic development, it needs to be restrained and controlled. And certainly for moral development, which is next in the hierarchy to spiritual development. And the springboard to spiritual development and the foundation of all secular life. Religion in particular prescribes many practices and vows by which willpower is increased. By which we become established in the moral path. And this moral path is very tricky. There can't be any real progress in life unless human beings have the capacity to restrain and sublimate the basic biological urges that we share with the lower forms of life. That basic energy becomes transformed through restraint and sublimation into physical, intellectual, aesthetic, moral, and spiritual pursuits that distinguish us as human beings and separate us from the rest of the animal kingdom. By practice of self-control, self-restraint, self-development, we become established in the moral path. And from the moral level, we can reach the transcendental level. But until we reach that transcendental level, we aren't safe. The path isn't safe just because we're okay so far. We can rest on the landing, but we're not safe. This is what Sri Ramakrishna refers to in his parable of the expert dancer. He says, it's just a sentence, the expert dancer never takes a wrong step. And all his steps and movements are rhythmic. That is, every step is dharmic because it refers to the realized soul who has reached the source of morality, who has realized God, and therefore every act, thought, and action is influenced by that understanding of the nature, the fundamental nature of reality, which is one, and from which all goodness and all morality and all unselfishness flows in the human plane. So they're in a safe spot, you see. And the world teachers, the avatars, are in such a safe spot that their lives demonstrate what's moral on the human plane, and they're studied for hundreds and thousands of years. They're still relevant. By gradual practice of self-control, we become established in the moral path, as I said. Now, how does this happen? Let us see how a person can rise by a graduated course of training. We have to rise from where we are, and it doesn't matter where we are, as long as we want to, as long as the direction is clear. Vivekananda says, take a person from where he stands and from there give him a lift. We can't start from a place where we aren't. So the teacher has to recognize where we are, and we have to have enough insight to know where we are. We can't pretend to be. We have to start, we have to put our feet on something when we start to walk. So let's start with a person who's not very developed in the moral sense. If a person is used to wrong action, like hurting others, let him try to stop injuring others. And there are people that are vindictive. You hurt, you scratch me, I'll take your hand off. Let him try to stop injuring others. He may not be able to do positive good to others, but let him at least not hurt others. This is an act of kindness for him. If you can't be unselfish, at least for your selfish ends, don't hurt others. Start here. And this is necessary for our own good, because we can't have peace of mind if we achieve our goals in an unfair way. By hurting others, we can't really have joy within ourselves. I once worked with juvenile delinquents many, many years ago, and the meanest kid we had didn't seem to have any remorse for anything that he did. And as I worked there longer, I realized, yeah, maybe he does. 'Cause I was told that he couldn't sleep at night because of his nightmares. On a conscious level, he was able to push it down, but at night, he wasn't. And it really undermines our joy in this life if we hurt other people. Gradually, by following this course, a person will be able to help others. So you start off by not hurting others, and with that as a foundation, you gradually develop the ability to actually do good to others. But you may not be able to make much self-sacrifice. That's the progression. From there, gradually, the self expands. The middle stage is here, is in trying to help others without sacrificing our own interest. Or for the sake of our own interest, we'll do good to others. This is enlightened self-interest. It's a targeted donation. What'll I get from it? It's a political move. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. You go along to get along. It's a more refined form of self-interest. It's not unselfishness. It's a higher, it's enlightened selfishness is what it is. But gradually, through the course of experience, a person develops the insight to know that virtue is a value in itself. How? Because that virtue expands us. And by virtue, I mean cultivating fellow feeling towards our fellow beings and overcoming anti-feeling. Anger, jealousy, hatred, pride have to be overcome with their opposites. And when this happens, we understand by the feedback that we get within our own minds and bodies that this expands us. It's called dharma in Sanskrit. And dharma is the way in which the transcendental truth of that all-pervading, loving consciousness manifest in us as the knower, that all-pervading, loving consciousness manifests on the human plane as virtue, fellow feeling towards our fellow being, and the acts that flow from it. Virtue expands us, and with this expansion we have more strength, more knowledge, more freedom. This insight comes gradually through experience, and in this process, external resources don't help as much as internal resources. Through this process, we become rich in internal resources, and those internal resources are a rock. We're able to maintain our balance in spite of adverse external circumstances. Now let's look at the ego again. We identify ourselves with this particular body-mind complex through a faculty called egoism. And selfishness proceeds from this egotism, and to the extent that the ego is identified with the body. Now you identify with food, shelter, clothing, family. Apparently the self gets expanded by identifying with the larger community. But in many cases, and you have to observe yourself, it's just an expansion of ego. Apparently a person makes the sacrifices for family, but they may not hesitate to cheat others to do that. Expansion of ego to include country and religion may be it may just be an expansion of ego rather than a true self-expansion into the spiritual realm. You have to watch it. Identification with country and religion has led to many wars and atrocities over the years. In those cases, it's an expansion of the ego rather than the self-manifestation of our higher selves. So to recap, self-denial leads to selflessness and an awareness of the higher self through that purification that comes through living in that manner, and that we're not confined within our own psychophysical constitutions, but dwell in others as well. As the Upanishad says, all beings in himself and himself in all beings. And with this realization, which comes in flashes and glimpses from time to time, as we grow, the sense of otherness goes. Fear comes from a sense of otherness. When the sense of otherness is gone, when the one self expands and enfolds all, there is love and love alone. From this self-expansion, from this self-manifestation, there is real manifestation of power, real manifestation of joy, real manifestation of freedom, real manifestation of knowledge. The more we confine ourselves within the shell of the ego, the more our power is restricted, our joy is restricted, our freedom restricted. It is by sacrificing this ego and all that is concerned with the ego that a person attains real self-development, self-manifestation through self-denial. And religion in particular teaches this principle. Don't hold to this ego. It is false. It is apparent. It is changing. But hold to that real self and know your kinship with the Supreme Being. Sacrifice this ego to the Supreme Being. Self-surrender is the motto of all theistic religion. Surrender yourself completely to the Lord. We aren't the masters even of ourselves. Whatever knowledge or power or joy we have, all has one source. For the time being, we exercise some power or hold some knowledge and consider it a great thing, but only in a relative sense and only temporarily. So many great thinkers, philosophers, intellects, in their later years, they lose it. Immanuel Kant had some kind of, what do they call it? We'd call it Alzheimer's or something now, but old age dementia as an old man. Such a brilliant philosopher. Truly speaking, there's only one master in this universe, only one source of all these things. And the more we cut off our individual lives from that one source, the more restricted we become in every respect. The more we link ourselves with that source, which is not far from us, which underlies all forms of existence, which cannot be apart from anything, the more expanded we become. So we talked about this initially. It's a question of whether the mind is looking up to the higher self or whether it's looking the other direction at the body. We see the outer forms of things, but not the underlying reality with a capital R. That underlying reality is subtle. It is the perfection of existence, ever shining, conscious of its own nature. And that underlying reality is manifest within us as the conscious self, the unchanging observer, the knower within. Because of this conscious self, we live. Because of this conscious self, we have the power of action. Because of this conscious self, we have the power of knowledge. Human beings experience joy and freedom and knowledge and love because of that conscious self that dwells within us. That conscious self is the innermost in human beings and in the universe. That innermost reality pervades everything in the same way, but its manifestation varies. Within living creatures, we see a little manifestation of consciousness. In human beings, we see more manifestation of consciousness. And that little expression of consciousness in human beings is responsible for all of humanity's greatness. The consciousness in human beings has taken the form of definite self-awareness. I know I exist. I am a conscious being. Fundamental. No argument is necessary to establish this, and no proof to negate that innate self-awareness. It is a partial expression of the consciousness, of the conscious, all-pervading reality as it exists in human beings that makes humans dominant of other living beings. Our philosophical knowledge, our ethical idealism, our spiritual illumination, our scientific and technical achievements are all due to the partial expression of the infinite underlying consciousness in our self-awareness on the human plane. This conscious expression finds greater manifestation the more we recognize it, the more we look up to the higher self. That is, the more we recognize and become aware of that conscious principle. Self-denial doesn't mean subjugation of the body-mind complex in a cruel or wanton manner. It doesn't mean starving ourselves or torturing ourselves. It means subordinating our psychophysical constitution, this body-mind complex, to the real self that underlies and sustains the existence of the mind and body. And it takes two forms. I've been talking about the conscious principle. But the other form it takes, and the practical form that it takes for most people, is the personal God, the all-beneficent creator, preserver, and destroyer of this universe that a person approaches with loving relationship. Either I am that, or I am his or hers. One of these ways, the path of knowledge or the path of bhakti, is good enough to get us liberation, to get that self-manifestation that's referred to in the title. We're focusing more now on the perspective of the path of knowledge. As a practical course, most of us follow the path of bhakti. But Vivekananda and Ramakrishna both emphasize that in this age, a combination of jnana, bhakti, and Raja Yoga is necessary. So we have to understand jnana, the path of knowledge, as well. Shankara has a little aphorism. Self-control means the direction of the body and the faculties of mind for self-development and self-realization. There are four aims of human life according to Hindu sociology: dharma, artha, kama, moksha. Self-control means direction of the body and the faculties of the mind for self-development and self-realization. Self-development refers to dharma, artha, kama, moksha. Artha, generally translated as success, means achievement in all aspects of life: physical, intellectual, aesthetic, moral. And the ability to gain wealth, but it's achievement in every aspect of secular life. And kama refers to legitimate desires. We get married. We have children. We perform the difficult task of raising those children to be responsible adults, to go forth in the world and make contribution and be decent human beings. That's a great achievement. It's difficult. It's a legitimate desire. It requires a great deal of self-restraint, self-control, and self-denial. And through that process, the glimpse of the higher life opens up, and we start looking up to the higher self, and the path to moksha, to liberation, opens up. Our fulfillment isn't in physical or intellectual development or even in aesthetic or moral development. Our fulfillment is in spiritual development as human beings. When the spiritual reality is experienced, we know our unity with the Supreme Being. Then only is our deepest longing for complete freedom and blissfulness, our deepest longing for perfection, completely fulfilled. Nothing else can satisfy it. By subordinating this relative changing existence of the body and mind to the ultimate goal of God realization is self-denial. And this can be practiced in graduated steps. From the valley, we can walk to the top of the mountain. This graduated training is self-discipline. Self-discipline, self-denial, self-control are used synonymously. Now, why is it so hard? What is the cause of the failure when we don't control the senses and the mind? It's because we identify with the senses and the mind, and we forget the knower, we forget the master. So this passage in the Katha Upanishad, we're going to kind of try to tie it up together with this, and then we'll conclude. This is verse 3 of chapter 2 of part 1 of the Katha Upanishad. Know the self, with a capital S, to be the master of the chariot. The chariot is the body, the buddhi. The determinative aspect of the mind is the driver, the charioteer. The mind is the reins. This self, in the verse, means the higher self, the Atman, the knower within, the unchanging observer. As we've discussed, each and every human being is a masked player, each person. The word person in Latin means masked player. We play many roles. We start as sons and daughters and then become parents of sons and daughters, shouldering the responsibilities of life. Students and then employees and then perhaps employers. We're constantly playing different roles. Masked player. That's the origin of person. And each time we play a role, we identify with it. I'm a man and man only. I'm a woman and woman only. I'm a husband and husband only. But we are, in fact, distinct from all these roles. These masks that we put on in this world, these disguises under which we work in this world, delude others, and these masks keep us in delusion. We need to know our distinction from all these roles and masks. So it starts, this verse, know this self, the Atman, to be the master of the chariot. And why chariot? The body-mind complex is a vehicle and not a prison house. That's why the Upanishads refer to it as a chariot. If it were more modern, it might refer to it as an automobile. Know the Atman to be the master of this chariot, the body, and the buddhi, the cognitive mind, is the charioteer, the driver. The Atman is the master, and the master can afford to have a chauffeur. This driver, the charioteer, is that aspect of the mind called the buddhi. And the mind holds the reins. That's another aspect of the mind, the willing and emotional aspect of the mind. And what do the reins hold? The reins hold the horses of the chariot, and the horses are the senses. So the senses are reined in by the volitional and emotional aspects of mind under the control of the cognitive mind, the buddhi, which is aligned. It's the part of the mind most closely aligned with Atman. Buddhi is lighted by the Atman and endowed with clear understanding. The buddhi has the power of understanding and deciding, as opposed to the deliberative aspect of mind that weighs the pros and cons. You can go on weighing the pros and cons of things indefinitely, forever. The determinative aspect of mind decides, definitely. It's the aha moment. Yes, that's it. Clear determination has the ability to bring will and emotion into line and to implement the decision and guide this vehicle of body and mind along the road of life. Clear determination. The buddhi is the chauffeur, the driver of the chariot, and above that, the Atman, the conscious principle, the real master. So I'll read the verses in the Katha Upanishad. Know the Atman to be the master of the chariot, the body is the chariot, the buddhi the charioteer, the mind the reins. The senses, they say, are the horses, and the objects of the senses the roads. That is, the sensible universe is the road traversed by the chariot of the body. If that discriminative aspect of mind, the buddhi, is related to a mind that is distracted, it loses its discrimination. Then the senses, the horses, become uncontrolled, like the vicious horses of a charioteer. And we may go into the ditch. If the buddhi being related to a distracted mind loses its discrimination and therefore remains always impure, then the embodied soul does not attain the supreme goal, but enters again into the round of birth and death. But if the buddhi being related to a mind that is restrained, possessed of discrimination, and therefore always pure, then the embodied soul attains that goal from which he is not born again. The person who has discrimination for his charioteer and holds the reins of the mind firmly reaches the end of the road, and that is the supreme beatitude of God realization. So self-denial is enjoined by all religions. The practice of self-denial is necessary at every stage of human life: physical, aesthetic, intellectual, moral, and especially for spiritual development. In order to say yes to what we are seeking, we have to say no to many things that impede or are unrelated to what we seek. Self-development or self-manifestation and self-denial go hand in hand in every aspect of life, and especially in this pursuit of spiritual development and God realization. I'll close with a prayer. Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnameva Vashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. This ever-changing, interdependent universe of things and beings is infinite. That unchanging, self-existent spiritual reality is infinite. This ever-changing universe, having come from that unchanging spiritual reality, that spiritual reality remains undivided, unchanged, complete, perfect, infinite. Peace, peace, peace be unto all. Now, the talk will be followed by a Zoom session, a Zoom question and answer session. And if you'd like to join in the question and answer session and haven't gotten an invitation, we send out invitations on Thursday, you can email us at join@vedantastl.org. I'll repeat that. Email us at join@vedantastl.org, and we'll get you into the question and answer session.